"They broke Mama's ribs. She can't feed my baby brothers," the Chinese girl cried. The lonely rancher wept and vowed, "I'll shelter her and kill the man who beat her." Snow drove hard across the prairie, cutting sideways like shards of glass, and Caleb Turner leaned into it, his horse's hooves muffled under the deepening drifts. He had ridden through storms before, but something in this night's silence unsettled him. The wind roared, and yet beneath it, faint and broken, he thought he heard a cry. He slowed, pulled his coat tight against the gusts, and listened. Again, thin, desperate, carried between the squalls, came the sound of a child's voice. He turned his horse toward it without hesitation, urging the animal through the bitter white. The land dipped toward a frozen creek. There, half buried in snow, a wagon leaned crooked on a broken axle, its canvas torn, flapping like a wounded bird. Beside it, a small figure staggered out, hair black as coal against the pale, her arms cradling two swaddled bundles. She could not have been more than 8 years old. She stumbled toward him, her face raw with cold, eyes wide in terror and hope. "Mister," she gasped, her breath a plume in the air, "please, Mama's ribs. She can't feed my brothers." Caleb dismounted before the horse had fully stopped. The girl's words trembled in him like a bell struck. He saw the bundles in her arms, tiny mouths opening and closing against the frigid night, crying too softly to be heard above the wind. His throat closed. He crouched to her height, his big hands steady though his chest burned with sudden ache. "Where is she?" His voice, low and even, carried urgency beneath its calm. The girl pointed back to the wagon. Caleb lifted her burdens first, drawing the swaddled infants into his arms, then guided the girl beside him. He pushed through the torn flap of canvas. Inside, a woman lay sprawled on a bed of ragged quilts, her face pale beneath the dark strands of her hair. Blood crusted at the corner of her lips, and her breaths rattled shallow, each one a struggle. A strip of dirty cloth was bound tight around her chest. She opened her eyes at the draft, saw him, and for an instant tried to rise before pain struck her back down. Caleb knelt beside her. The heat of rage swelled in him as he took in the marks along her skin, the purple bruises spreading across her ribs, the way she winced at the smallest movement. No storm could blind him to the truth of what had been done. "Don't," he murmured, laying a hand gently on her shoulder. His words were simple, but his tone carried more than command. It carried a promise of safety. The girl pressed close to him, her little frame trembling. "He beat her," she whispered, voice raw. "He hit Mama with his boot till she couldn't breathe. Then he laughed. Said we weren't worth the feed for his cattle." Caleb's chest tightened. He had seen cruelty in men before, fists raised in saloons, fists raised in war, but the sight of this woman broken, her child forced to speak such words, pierced him deeper than he could bear. He blinked hard, the cold wind stinging his eyes, but tears cut through all the same. He bowed his head so the girl would not see. "We can't stay here," he said finally, his voice hoarse. He shifted the infants into the crook of one arm and, with his free hand, gathered the frail woman into his strength. She moaned softly, but he hushed her with care. "I've got you," he said, more to himself than her. Step by step, he carried her from the wreck of the wagon, the girl stumbling at his side. The horse stamped nervously at the gusts, but Caleb steadied it with a word and laid the mother across the saddle as tenderly as if she were glass. He lifted the children into the wagon bed, wrapped them in his thick coat, then swung up behind the woman, holding her steady against his chest. The girl climbed up beside the bundled infants, clinging to the wood rail. Snow swept around them, a blinding sheet. Caleb urged the horse forward, every stride sinking deep. The cold gnawed at his beard, iced his lashes, but he kept his eyes on the dim horizon, where his cabin waited in the hills. Behind him, through the veil of white, he thought he saw a shape, a man on horseback, far enough to blur, close enough to chill his blood. The figure did not follow, only watched, and the storm swallowed him again. Caleb's jaw clenched. Whoever had done this was near, and bold enough to come after them. The woman stirred in his arms, her breath shallow against his coat. He bent his head close to hear her. She whispered something in a language he did not know, the syllables soft, flowing, full of sorrow. Then she shuddered, eyes closing. Caleb held her tighter, urging the horse on. The girl's voice rose against the wind. "Is Mama gonna die?" Caleb looked at her, her thin face red with cold, her eyes filled with more courage than a child should bear, and the truth lodged heavy in his throat. He could not lie, and yet he could not crush her hope. "Not while I breathe," he said. The miles dragged. Snow lashed his face. Twice the horse nearly stumbled, and each time Caleb whispered steady words into its ear, coaxing it onward. The children whimpered from the wagon, their tiny fists pushing through the blankets. The girl huddled over them, whispering to keep them calm, whispering prayers in broken English and another tongue that sounded like music even in despair. At last the dark outline of his cabin rose through the storm, low, sturdy, crouched against the hill like a beast guarding its den. Relief struck him like a blow, but fear followed fast. Could he keep them safe there, once the storm broke and the man behind them came calling? He forced the thought aside. Survival first. The rest would come. He dismounted, lowered the woman into his arms again, and shouldered the cabin door open with his boot. Heat breathed out to meet him, the faint fire he had left glowing in the hearth still alive. He laid her gently upon his bed, tucked with wool blankets, then returned to carry the infants inside, the girl following close. The woman's eyes fluttered open once more. She looked about the room, the rough-hewn walls, the single shelf of books, the rifle above the door, and then to Caleb himself. Her lips parted as if to speak, but only a rasp emerged. He poured water, lifted her head with care, let her sip. She winced but did not turn away. The girl clutched his sleeve. "She needs to rest," she said, with a child's firmness. "When she breathes, it hurts. Don't let him find her." Caleb's hand closed over hers, calloused and trembling. He nodded once. "He won't," he said, though a shadow passed over his eyes. The storm battered the walls, rattled the shutters, but inside, firelight flickered warm against wood and flesh. Caleb sat in the rocker, cradling one of the infants, the child's tiny body fitting like a secret into his vast hands. The baby rooted against the air, fussing for what his mother's body could not give. Caleb's throat ached again. He remembered nights long past when his own wife had held their stillborn child and wept into silence. The woman stirred, watching him through half-lidded eyes. Pain still lined her face, yet some faint measure of trust seemed to soften it. The girl leaned against Caleb's arm, exhaustion finally winning. Together, in that fragile warmth, they found a moment of safety. Temporary, fragile, but real. Outside, though, snow muffled every sound. And far in the white distance, where the storm thinned, a horse's shadow stood unmoving, its rider watching the cabin light glow against the dark. The night held its breath, and with it, the promise that safety would not last. Caleb had not planned for visitors, let alone the kind of company that changed the air of a place, but the cabin welcomed them with the stubborn warmth of old pine logs and the faint glow of embers. He crouched by the hearth, coaxing flame from coals until fire leapt alive, shadows dancing over the rough walls. The small room smelled of smoke, wool, and melted snow. For a moment, it seemed to breathe with him, as though the cabin itself understood the weight he had carried through the storm. The woman lay on his bed, her face washed pale by exhaustion, her chest bound in clean cloth where bruises blossomed purple. The girl hovered at her side, pressing a hand to her mother's arm as if touch alone could anchor her here. Caleb said nothing at first. He worked quietly, pouring water from the kettle, laying out the bread and salt pork he had stored away. His movements were steady, careful, like a man used to silence. The girl broke it. "She needs food," she whispered, her voice so thin it almost folded into the crackle of the fire. "But it hurts her when she swallows." Caleb nodded. He crushed some of the bread into a bowl, soaked it with warm broth, then cooled it with a breath before bringing it to the woman's lips. She turned her head weakly. He waited patient, then lifted only a small corner of the spoonful again. This time, she parted her lips and took it, her lashes fluttering closed as she swallowed. He offered another, and another, until she pushed his hand gently away. The girl exhaled relief. "Thank you, mister." Caleb set the bowl down. "Name's Caleb Turner." She gave a quick bob of her head. "I'm Lien. Mama's Mei Lin." He repeated the names softly, as though committing them to stone. He looked at the sleeping infants nestled in blankets by the fire. Tiny bodies rising and falling with shallow breaths, fragile as snowflakes. The night stretched long. Caleb moved about the cabin with deliberate quiet, mending the fire, melting snow for water, cutting strips of linen for the woman's wounds. Each task was practical, but behind every gesture ran the undercurrent of awe and dread. Awe at their fragile survival, dread of the shadow that lingered somewhere in the storm outside. When one of the infants whimpered, Caleb lifted the child with surprising gentleness for a man whose hands bore calluses deep as river stones. The baby fussed against his chest, mouth searching, but Mei Lin turned away, her face contorted with pain. Lien pressed her fists against her eyes, whispering that Mama couldn't feed them anymore. Caleb felt something break inside him. He dipped a rag into warmed milk, pressed it against the child's lips, and watched as tiny gums closed around it, drawing life from this poor substitute. The girl's eyes widened. "You know how." He gave the faintest shrug. "My wife once showed me. Long time ago." His gaze didn't linger on the past, but the firelight caught the wetness in his eyes before he blinked it away. Hours passed. Wind battered the shutters, but the storm outside seemed far away compared to the fragile warmth within. The rhythm of care wove them together. Caleb rising to tend the fire, the girl fetching water, the woman stirring now and then to sip broth or whisper a word in her own tongue that Caleb did not understand. It was a word heavy with gratitude, though, and he bowed his head slightly each time he heard it. The silence between them was not empty. It filled with unspoken things, the girl's trust in his steady presence, the woman's flickering courage, his own quiet vow never to let harm reach them again. Small gestures built the bond, a blanket tucked more snugly, a hand guiding the girl back from the hot hearth, the brief meeting of eyes across the room that said more than speech could manage. Near dawn, when the storm's voice softened, Caleb stepped outside. Snow glittered under a faint moon, drifts piled high against the barn and corral. The land stretched vast and white, silent as a prayer. He breathed deep, the air raw in his lungs, and felt the weight of decision pressing him down. To shelter them meant more than giving warmth. It meant crossing a line, defying whoever claimed ownership through cruelty. He muttered low into the night, words only the wind heard, "Not while I draw a breath." Inside, the firelight had grown golden. Lien sat curled on a chair, half asleep, her head nodding but her eyes still darting to her mother at each sound. Caleb lifted her gently, set her beneath a quilt on the bench. She murmured but did not resist, drifting finally into dreams. He returned to the rocker with one infant in his arms, the other nestled near Mei Lin. The baby's tiny fingers curled around his thumb, grip astonishing in its fragile strength. Caleb stared at that hand for a long time, his breath catching. Mei Lin's eyes opened, watching him. Her gaze held pain, but also the faintest spark of wonder. She whispered something, her voice rasping but soft. He shook his head gently. "Don't try too hard." She closed her eyes again, but he felt the weight of her trust settle on him like a mantle. The day broke pale through frost-rimmed windows. Caleb busied himself with chores, the habit of survival. He chopped wood, the axe thudding into the block, steam rising from his shoulders. Each strike seemed to drive his thoughts deeper. When he returned with the armload, he found Lien already awake, spooning water carefully to her brothers. She looked up at him with solemn eyes too old for her years. "You're not afraid of him, are you?" she asked quietly. Caleb laid the wood by the hearth, his jaw tightening. "Fear's natural," he said, "but I don't let it run me." She nodded, satisfied, and returned to her task. Through the hours, the cabin became less strange to them. Lien began to hum while folding quilts, the infants slept in turns, and Mei Lin managed to sit propped against pillows. Her breath still came shallow, but color touched her cheeks again. She watched Caleb with guarded curiosity, as if weighing what sort of man he was. He never pressed her with questions. He gave her silence, space, and steady presence. When dusk approached, a knock startled the room. Caleb's hand reached the rifle above the door before he breathed again. It was only Samuel Green, his neighbor, a man older, thin as a fence rail, face lined by wind and years. Samuel stamped snow from his boots and looked around the cabin with wary eyes. "You've taken in strangers," Samuel said, his voice blunt. Caleb answered simply, "They needed shelter." Samuel's gaze rested on Mei Lin, then on the children. He frowned. "You know whose they are?" Caleb's silence was answer enough. Samuel shifted uncomfortably. "Word is, Harlan Briggs is lookin'. He claims what ain't his by any right, but you know how this town listens when a man shouts loud enough." The name hung in the room like smoke. Maylene's eyes darkened, her hand tightening on the quilt. Lien pressed close to her side. Caleb stood firm, his shadow stretched by the firelight. "They stay here." Samuel sighed. "Then be ready. Briggs won't stop." He left without more, his boots crunching into the snow. The door closed, but the echo of his warning lingered. Caleb looked at the woman, at the girl, at the children whose breaths were so small the fire nearly drowned them. He felt the shift deep within him. Not the simple duty of a man who gave aid, but the rising certainty of one who would fight for them as if they were his own. That night, he checked the locks twice, set extra wood by the hearth, and laid his rifle within arm's reach. He sat by the window, watching the snow glow under the moon. Behind him, the fire crackled, Maylene's breath eased in sleep, and the infants dreamed in fragile peace. Yet through the stillness, he felt eyes on him from the ridge, the same shadow that had lingered before. The bond inside the cabin had grown, thread by thread, into something stronger than chance. But outside, danger gathered shape, waiting for the storm to break. The storm broke after 3 long days, leaving the land glazed in white that glittered under a pale sun. Smoke rose steady from the cabin's chimney, a fragile line of warmth against the vast, frozen sky. Caleb Turner split logs by the barn, each strike echoing sharp in the clear air. The rhythm steadied him, but he knew the stillness outside only meant trouble could travel easier now. Tracks would hold in the snow. Riders would move fast. Inside, the cabin had shifted from mere refuge to a space alive with quiet routine. Lien swept the floor with a broom far too tall for her, pausing often to peek at her brothers who slept in their bundle by the hearth. Mei Lin sat upright now, her back braced against pillows Caleb had stuffed with fresh straw. Her color had returned slightly, though pain still tightened her mouth each time she breathed deep. She watched her daughter move with tender eyes, but the shadow behind them had not lifted. Caleb saw it when she thought no one looked. That evening, while the fire painted the walls gold and the babies whimpered for feeding, Mei Lin whispered something to her daughter in their tongue. Lien hesitated, then came to Caleb where he sharpened his knife at the table. "She says, I should tell you," Lien murmured, eyes downcast. "About before. About why he hurt her." Caleb set the knife down, the rasp of steel against stone falling silent. He gestured gently for her to sit. The girl perched on the bench, clutching her skirt. Her voice wavered at first, but soon the words flowed, halting but clear. "Mama came here with Papa, years ago. He worked on the railroad, laying track. They said there would be pay enough for food, enough for us to live. But he died in a cave-in. After, no one helped her. No family. Just men who laughed that she was alone." Lien's hands twisted in her lap. "Briggs found us. He said he'd keep us safe, but he lied. He wanted Mama for himself. When she said no, she swallowed hard, her small frame shaking. He beat her. Said we were his property now." Caleb's jaw hardened, though he kept his voice low for her sake. "And that's when you ran." She nodded. "A friend from the camp. He hid us in the wagon. We left in the night. But Briggs saw. He chased us. He broke the wheel with his gun, then kicked Mama. She could not walk. I thought—" She broke off, tears finally spilling. Caleb reached across the table, resting his broad hand lightly over hers. "You did right bringing her here. You kept them alive." Lien looked at him, eyes glistening. For the first time, her lips curved in something almost like a smile. Later, when the children slept and Lien dozed by their side, Mei Lin stirred. She motioned weakly toward Caleb. He stepped closer, crouched to hear her. Her English came fractured but clear enough. He will come. Briggs. He always come for what he think is his. Caleb met her gaze, dark and unwavering. Then he'll find I don't give easy. Her breath caught, half a laugh, half a sob, before she closed her eyes again. The next day he rode to town for supplies, leaving Lien to watch over her mother. The settlement buzzed with whispers as he walked through the general store. Men glanced, women murmured. Caleb ignored them until Samuel Green sidled close. "You've stirred the hornet's nest, Turner," Samuel said under his breath. "Briggs is riled. Says you stole what's his. Folks are split. Some think he's a brute, some think he's got claim by law, seeing as she worked under his roof." Caleb's hand closed on the sack of flour he carried, knuckles white. "Ain't no law makes a man's fists rightful." Samuel's gaze was grim. "You know he'll come. And he won't come alone." Caleb left without more words. Outside, a pair of ranch hands leaned against the hitching post, watching him with smirks too sharp to be friendly. One spat into the snow, muttering something about a China woman thief. Caleb mounted his horse without reply, but fire burned in his chest. He kept it banked until he reached the ridge above his cabin, where smoke curled steady from the chimney. Only then did he let the anger rise fully, knowing who it was for. That evening he prepared. He cleaned the rifle with slow, careful motions, laid traps near the trail leading to his land, and stacked more wood inside. Maylin watched from the bed, her eyes following each gesture. At last she whispered, "Why? You could send us away. Safer." Caleb paused, then shook his head. "Safer for who?" "Him. So he can do it again to someone else." He set the rifle aside, his voice low but certain. "Not while I breathe." Her lips trembled. She looked away, but a tear slid down her cheek. She brushed it quickly with her sleeve, ashamed of being seen. Caleb pretended not to notice, giving her back the dignity she guarded so fiercely. The days passed with tension like a taut rope. Caleb taught Lien small tasks, how to stack wood proper, how to sweep ash from the hearth, how to heat milk without scorching. Each time she succeeded, pride flickered across her young face. He saw in her the steel of survival, tempered too early, yet bright with resilience. Maylin grew stronger, able to sit longer, to smile faintly when her children cooed. The cabin, once echoing with solitude, now pulsed with the fragile rhythm of family. But shadows lengthened outside. Travelers brought word of Briggs gathering men, offering coin for anyone willing to ride with him. He told the saloon crowd Turner had stolen his woman, his property, his honor. Some laughed, some believed, but all agreed he meant to set it right with violence. One evening, Samuel rode hard to Caleb's door. His face was pale under the frost. "They're coming," he said. "Briggs and 2 men at least. Maybe more waiting down the valley. Best you move her out, tonight." Caleb's eyes went to the woman resting by the fire, the children asleep in their quilt, the girl leaning against her mother's side. His decision was instant, carved deep as stone. "She stays. I'll face him here." Samuel swore under his breath. "Then may God keep you, Turner." He rode off into the dusk, his warning trailing in the cold. Inside, silence pressed heavy. Lien looked at Caleb with wide eyes. "He's really coming?" Caleb laid a hand on her shoulder, firm, steady. "Yes. But he won't take you. Not your mama. Not your brothers. Not ever." Maylin's gaze held his, long and searching. Something unspoken passed between them. Fear, yes, but also a spark of belief. For the first time since she had been carried from that broken wagon, she did not look away. That night, Caleb kept watch by the window, rifle across his knees. The moon spilled silver over the snow, making the world too bright for comfort. Somewhere out there, horses shifted, riders whispered, waiting for their moment. The cabin, small and fragile, seemed a lone ship adrift in an endless sea of white. Maylin stirred behind him, her voice soft but steady. "He will kill you." Caleb turned, his face half lit by moonlight. "Maybe. But he'll not touch you again." Her breath shivered, but she held his gaze. Then, slowly, she lowered her eyes to the children, and her hand rested on them with a mother's fierce claim. She whispered something in her tongue, words he could not understand but felt in his bones, a prayer, a vow, or perhaps both. The cabin grew still. The fire crackled low. Caleb's eyes stayed fixed on the ridge, where shadows moved against the snow, drawing closer with each passing hour. By dawn, there would be blood on the white. The snow had thinned to a glassy crust that crunched under hoofbeats, every sound carrying sharp in the brittle air. Caleb Turner sat by the cabin window, rifle balanced across his knees, his breath fogging against the glass. Dawn's first light bled pale across the ridgeline, revealing 3 riders moving slow but sure down the valley trail. They did not rush, did not hide, for men like them carried confidence in cruelty, the kind that believed fear itself was a weapon. Caleb's jaw tightened. He had known this hour would come, but knowing did not soften the weight of it. Behind him the fire crackled faint, the warmth of the room delicate compared to the cold pressing outside. Maylin sat upright in the bed, ribs bound, her eyes shadowed but awake. She held one of her infants against her chest, her hands steady though her breath caught with each cry. Lien stood at the hearth, staring wide-eyed at the window as if she could see the riders too. Caleb turned to her, his voice low. "Take your brothers to the back corner. Keep them close. Don't come out unless I call." Her lips trembled, but she nodded. She gathered the bundled infants, whispering soothing words, and guided them to the shadows near the wall. Caleb's gaze followed her until she crouched low, almost hidden, her face pale but her eyes bright with trust. He felt the steel of that trust in his bones, and it made him grip the rifle tighter. The hoofbeats drew closer, steady as a drumbeat before war. Caleb stood, pulled his coat across his shoulders, and stepped to the door. The cold hit his face sharp, but he hardly felt it. He walked onto the porch, boots crunching the snow, and stood tall against the lightening sky. The riders reined in a dozen yards away. Harlan Briggs sat at the center, a heavy man with a face coarse as the land itself, his eyes small and mean beneath a hat brim dusted white. His beard bristled, his lips curled in a sneer. To his left and right rode 2 hired men, leaner but no less cruel, rifles resting easy across their saddles. Briggs spat into the snow, the sound carrying. "Turner, you've got something of mine inside that cabin." Caleb's voice came steady, low. "You've got nothing here." Briggs's laugh was harsh, scraping the frozen air. "You shelter a thief. A woman who belonged under my roof. She ran with what's mine, and you've hidden her." His eyes narrowed, glittering. "I'll give you this one chance. Hand her over, and maybe I'll let your place stand." Caleb raised the rifle, barrel pointed true. "She ain't yours. She never was. You lay another hand on her, you'll answer to me." The air snapped taut, silence stretching like drawn wire. One of the hired men shifted, muttering, but Briggs held up a hand. He slid from his saddle slow, snow crunching under his boots, his bulk swaying with confidence. "You think you can keep her? Think you're some savior? You're just a fool alone on a patch of land, and I've broken better men than you." Caleb's finger brushed the trigger. "Step closer and you'll find me unbroken." For a heartbeat the world held still. Then one of the hired guns twitched first, lifting his rifle. The crack split the morning, echoing across the valley. Caleb dropped to the porch rail, firing in return. The shot struck wood near Briggs's shoulder, splinters flying. The hired man cursed, ducking behind his horse. The second rode to flank, gunfire peppering the cabin wall, shattering a window. Inside, the children cried, and Maylin pressed them close, whispering to keep them silent though her own breath shook. Caleb's heart pounded like the hoofbeats of 100 horses. He moved with calm born from years of survival, sliding to the corner post, firing clean, forcing the riders back from their easy confidence. A bullet nicked his arm, heat slicing through coat and flesh, but he gritted his teeth, never lowering his aim. Snow flew in bursts where shots struck ground. Horses reared, snorting white into the cold. Briggs roared, his voice carrying above the gunfire. "Burn him out. Take the cabin." One of the hired men broke for the barn, torch in hand, but his boot caught a snare Caleb had set the night before. The man went down hard, his rifle skittering across ice, the torch dying in the snow. Caleb fired once. The shot clean through the man's shoulder, spinning him into silence. The second pressed close to the cabin, circling wide. Caleb ducked back inside, breath ragged, blood soaking his sleeve. Lien looked at him with wide eyes, clutching her brother's. Mei Lin met his gaze, her face pale but fierce. She mouthed only one word. "Stay." Caleb nodded, then moved to the back window. The second man crouched near the barn, loading quick, but he hadn't seen the steer penned close by. Caleb whistled low, sharp. The steer bellowed, charging against the corral gate until it burst wide. Snow and wood flew, the beast goring straight toward the crouched gunman. The man screamed, scrambled, and disappeared beneath hooves and horns. Silence followed, broken only by the animal's snorts. Briggs cursed, fury echoing. He stomped toward the cabin, shotgun in hand, face twisted. Caleb met him at the door, rifle raised. The two men faced each other, firelight flickering behind Caleb, dawn glowing behind Briggs. "You should have handed her over," Briggs growled. "You should have never touched her," Caleb answered. Briggs swung the shotgun up. Caleb fired, but Briggs had already lunged inside, the shot grazing his side, tearing cloth and skin but not slowing him. The rifle knocked from Caleb's hands as Briggs crashed into him, both men slamming against the table, splintering wood. The cabin shook with the force of their struggle, the fire hissing sparks. Mei Lin screamed, clutching the children, but her eyes burned with something fierce, no longer only fear. Lien pressed against the wall, sobbing prayers, but her gaze never left Caleb. The fight raged brutal, hand to hand. Briggs's fists were heavy, slamming against Caleb's ribs, his jaw. Pain burst white in Caleb's skull, but he gripped back, driving a knee into Briggs's gut, slamming his head against the hearthstone. Blood-smeared wood, firelight glinting red. Briggs roared like an animal, seizing Caleb's throat. Caleb clawed for breath, vision blurring. He reached, found the iron poker by the hearth, and swung with every ounce left in him. The poker cracked across Briggs's temple. The man reeled, stumbled, then lunged again. Caleb met him with a shoulder, driving him into the stone hearth. The impact shook the cabin. Briggs sagged, eyes rolling, his body collapsing in a heap at Caleb's boots. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of fire and the infant's whimpers. Caleb stood swaying, chest heaving, blood dripping from his arm and mouth. He looked down at the man sprawled across his floor, the brute who had thought fists made ownership. Briggs's eyes fluttered, then stilled, his breath rattling once before fading. Caleb dropped the poker, his hand trembling. He turned, meeting Mei Lin's gaze. She clutched her children close, tears streaming down her face, not of fear now but of release. Lien rushed from the corner, throwing her small arms around Caleb's waist. "You kept us safe," she cried, voice muffled against his coat. He knelt, wrapping his good arm around her, holding her tight. His eyes burned, tears slipping unbidden, but he did not hide them. "No one will ever hurt you again," he whispered. Mei Lin rose unsteadily, pain racking her but will stronger. She crossed the room, her hand trembling as it touched Caleb's shoulder. For the first time her voice was steady, her English broken but full of weight. "You saved us. You wept for us. No man ever did." He looked up at her, the firelight haloing her face, her children pressed against her. In that moment the cabin, the snow, the blood, everything else fell away. There was only the truth standing before him, fragile yet unbroken. Dawn poured gold through the shattered window, light spilling across the floor where Briggs's shadow no longer loomed. The world outside lay white and endless, but inside, warmth grew fierce, alive, undeniable. Caleb sank to sit against the wall, exhaustion heavy, but his heart steady. Lien still clung to him, Mei Lin beside him, the infants fussing softly. For the first time in years, he felt not alone, but bound to something worth every drop of blood spilled. Outside, silence stretched wide over the prairie. The snow bore the marks of struggle, but the cabin stood firm, smoke curling steady into the sky. Inside, Mei Lin whispered to her children in her own tongue, her words carrying a melody of comfort. Caleb listened, eyes closing, the sound soothing the ache in his bones. He knew the fight was not the end of hardship, not in this land, not in this life. But it was the end of one man's cruelty, and the beginning of something else, something stronger, tender, and unyielding as the snow itself. The fire flared bright, throwing sparks toward the rafters. Caleb opened his eyes, staring into the glow, and let the weight of the moment press fully into him. He reached for Maylene's hand, rough and scarred meeting soft and trembling, and she did not pull away. The cabin breathed with them, alive with warmth and fragile hope. But beyond the walls, the vast prairie stretched silent, endless, and watching, as if waiting to see what would grow from this seed of defiance. For now, they had survived. And survival, in this land, was everything.